Thanks, ma'am. Thanks for your time again. I have a question. Can you please give an insight on what is Ambedkar's stance on Sanskrit? Because I was talking to one of RSS Sangi here. So he was saying that Ambedkar supported Sanskrit and why you guys are against Sanskrit. So he was saying that. So what is his stand on Sanskrit especially?
Ambedkar supported Sanskrit is a very global statement. Ambedkar understood Sanskrit to be the language of scriptural authority and therefore a language which had encoded within itself authority. And he was determined that Dalits and others should have access to that authority. He himself was not allowed to study Sanskrit in Bombay when he was a student there. So he was determined that Sanskrit is a resource that everyone has access to. But this does not mean that he endorsed the superior claims that were being made on the behalf of the language as the language of the gods. For him, it was a language whose knowledge had been withheld from others. So therefore, it was important for him to democratize our access to Sanskrit. And Sanskrit is the means through which you can access parts of ancient Indian history, which for his purpose were very important. So to that extent, he upheld the importance of studying Sanskrit, not out of any ideological love for all the content that is there in Sanskrit or because he felt it was a divine language.
Okay, thanks, sir. But some BJP supporters and RSS were saying that he proposed Sanskrit to be an official language of India. Is that true or?
Well, he does refer to the possibilities of Sanskrit being something that could be understood across India only in the sense that it was available as a language to be learned by anyone because it is not linked to territory in any specific sense. But he does not say this, again, I have to make this clear, because he thinks it's a superior language or that it's a divine language. It's exactly like what he said when he was a student, that we may be very heterogeneous, but we are held together by caste. So likewise, we may be very heterogeneous and have different languages, but Sanskrit as a language of spiritual power and authority has always been available to a section of us throughout history, across the subcontinent. It is in that sense that he uses the word, it's available across India.
Okay, thanks, ma'am. Thanks.
Hello, ma'am. My question to you is that in the triumph of Brahmanism, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, that in the triumph of Brahmanism and in Bhagavad Gita, we see a new side of Ambedkar, which is him as a historian of ancient India. So my question to you would be is that how have historians of ancient India, to what extent, and what is their nature of engagement with Baba Sahib and his works on ancient India and Brahmanism?
Right. Thank you. That's a good question. Ambedkar followed debates within historiography of his own time, and I had a chance to look at his personal collection of books at Siddhartha College, and it's quite interesting that he has almost all the important historians writing on this subject in his shelves. He also has people who were not really historians, but who were writing on ancient India, like Bhupendranath Datta, Vivekananda's brother, whose book Studies in Ancient in Indian Polity influenced Ambedkar quite a bit. But having said that, those who were writing in his own time and after, like say D.D. Kosambi or Ramcharan Sharma, R.S. Sharma, who wrote the Shudras, they seem to have been, D.D. Kosambi and Ambedkar don't actually write of each other's work, though their work was somewhat parallel and they both were sort of coming to similar conclusions, but neither refers to the other, which is an interesting mystery which some of us might want to sort of solve at some point. But R.S. Sharma certainly knew his work, and he has a sort of slightly dismissive reference to Ambedkar's Who Were the Shudras in his own text, The Shudras, where he talks of this being a sort of political response to the question of the Shudras. Though elsewhere in the book, he goes on to invoke Ambedkar. So there was that particular reference you get from R.S. Sharma. Subsequently, for a long time, Indian historians of ancient India didn't quite consider Ambedkar's writings on history as responses of a man grappling with history or as a historian coming to history from outside of the discipline, until, of course, the turn in the 1990s when Ambedkar's ideas and thoughts became very, very central to public and political debates, thanks to the assertive Dalit movements of that time, and thanks to the preservation of his memory by Bahujan Dalit communities. So then I think writers of ancient India do reference Ambedkar, but they don't reference him as a historian, just as they don't reference him as a sociologist. So I think what's interesting is to how do you approach somebody who was not trained in this so-called discipline, so to speak, but who had very pertinent and very startlingly original historical questions to ask. And I think we are yet to come to terms with some of those questions. And even those of us who read Ambedkar seem to want to point to what is the content of his work, which he shares with others, rather than to the more original, radical logic of his questioning. And I think that's where Ambedkar's importance as a student and learner of history lies.
Thank you, ma'am. I had a question. It's really interesting to learn about how Ambedkar drew his vision for an egalitarian India from Buddhism and non-Western thought about a non-Western kind of ideas of equality. But we also know, as you talked about, he was really influenced by the Enlightenment and American Revolution and French Revolution as well. So I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit more about how he squared together Buddhist notions of equality and Western Enlightenment notions of equality. And then I was also wondering about how, the Buddhist civilizational idea as a resource for Indian nationalism, anti-colonial Indian nationalism, that seems to really square well with tackling the caste question. But how did he think about how that would have squared with the persisting kind of exclusion of the Muslim question? That I would still come up in Buddhist civilizational nationalism as we see today in Sri Lanka and in Myanmar.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Those are all very, very good questions. I don't know if I can do justice to all of them. I'll pick up some of those questions later on also. So very interestingly, in his early writings, Ambedkar constantly references the French Revolution and the Enlightenment and the very rich history of Christian socialism also. So it's very, very, his sources for drawing ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity are very eclectic. And I think it's important that we don't take a post-colonial lens to him, because he doesn't really see it as Western and non-Western so much as modern and pre-modern. So he sees himself as equally invested in modernity as anyone else. So in that sense, I think his early writings and throughout his life, he keeps up that interest. But when he starts writing self-consciously about Buddhism, which I think he meant to from the mid-30s onwards, and which for the first time you see very clearly spelt in What Path to Salvation, he wanted us to see the Buddha's views on equality as something that is not decided by birth, but by one's actions, and which is something that evolves out of a mechanism of thought and action together. So he retains that sense of connectedness in reasoning and action, and the idea that action is what produces character from within Buddhism, rather than birth deciding the nature of one's being, so to speak. And from there, he moves on to the notion of equality. And liberty, of course, is something interesting, because liberty is very much a this-worldly virtue for many of us, considering that many of us can't access liberty. But for Ambedkar, liberty was both this worldly and also in his later writings in the sense of salvation itself, as far as the Dalits were concerned, emancipation. And there, the Buddhist notion of nirvana, he endows with a solid sociological and political resonance. But he doesn't give up entirely on the larger philosophical idea of nibbana also, because let's not forget he was an inveterate opponent of property and what he often called the acquisitive instinct. So there's that also. So he might have set himself against this consumption-driven economy today, where he to continue to live amongst us. So therefore, the idea of nibbana and attachment also figure in his writings in Buddha and his Dhamma. And of course, Maitri, it's a very dear ideal to him. And while fraternity is something he draws from the French Revolution, I think when it comes to Maitri, he endows it with a certain richness which is not to be found in just the notion of fraternity. So that's how he connects the world of Buddhism and the world of modern thought. The question of Buddhism as offering a civilizational resource is, I think, a very important question. And how does one then think of the Muslim question in that context? And I think here we may want to sort of separate Ambedkar's understanding of Buddhism as a civilizational resource from the way Theravada Buddhism has been for, say, Burma or Sri Lanka in the present period, especially after the colonial period, where both have, in both states, the idea of Buddhism as it existed in those states have gone on to inflect state making itself. We know this very clearly from Sri Lanka, and more recently from Burma, we see that. Now, Ambedkar was not enamored of Theravada Buddhism as it existed in both these countries. So his vision of the Buddha, which is what he says is a Navayana form of Buddhism, he makes it available as a resource that emerges out of a particular historical path rather than out of a particular set of doctrines. And those who have read Buddha and his Dhamma will recognize that very well. But having said that, and we shall see this in greater detail when we look at Pakistan or the partition of India on Thursday, there is that tension between his vision for the Indian nation, which is couched in this Navayana understanding of Buddhism, and his understanding of the national question in more conventional terms. So we'll sort of look at that tension later on Thursday. Thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Jai Bhim, Professor.
Jai Bhim. Jai Bhim.
My question sort of draws from the analysis of Ambedkar, which you discussed today on revolution and counter-revolution. And I want to draw your attention to an article that Anand Teltunde wrote, which was titled Saffronizing Ambedkar on the RSS inversion of the idea of India. So he points out how during the tenure of Bala Saheb Deore's as the Sarsang Chalak, there was active work by the Sangh among the Dalits to co-opt them into the saffron fold, and in which is sort of contradicting, because Ambedkar's comments that we are reading right now on Hinduism should have actually made him the greatest enemy of the Parivar. So my question is basically how does casteism has been synchronized with this Sangh Parivar's newfound love for Ambedkar, and how Ambedkar has been dwarfed to a stature of a petty communalist, all in the hope of bringing the Dalit community into its fold. That's my question, Professor.
Yes, thank you. This is actually a very sort of old project with the Sangh Parivar, not necessarily a new one. I think in policy terms, Diores might have given it a certain shape and form. But let's just go back to that one existing biography of Ambedkar in English, which is Dhananjay Keer's study. And anyone who has read that book will know that throughout the book, Keer constantly praises Savarkar. Now, that's very interesting. Why does he do that? Because I think the idea of claiming Ambedkar for a broad, what at least Keer thinks is a radical vision of Hindu society, which is also committed to the ending of caste and the ending of untouchability. This is something that Savarkar stood for, is something that Keer wants us to believe and trust, which is against the grain of anything that Savarkar stood for. And those of us who read Savarkar knows that. And I've often asked my Marathi speaking friends, is there something to do with the kind of historiographical tensions in modern Marathi writing between those who sort of look at Shivaji and the entire set of issues around caste and religion that are associated with Shivaji? So on the one hand, Shivaji has become a kind of symbol for non-Brahmin assertion. On the other hand, he is also co-opted into being seen as an anti-Muslim ruler. And thirdly, a symbol of Maratha pride and so on. So out of the welter of these arguments, it is possible to therefore bring together notions of non-Brahminism, Hinduism, and anti-Muslim ideas. And you find that even the great S.K. Bole, who was a very important reform figure, later in his life joining the Hindu Mahasabha. So I think some of this has to do with the particularities of debate to do with history and identity and culture within Maharashtra. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not an expert on Western Indian history. I'm just saying this, picking it up from various writings I have read. So that is something that we may want to consider. At the second level, the Hindu right wing has always tried to posit itself as wanting to reform Hindu society and wanting to create a more inclusive society so that it can challenge alien influences. And one of the ways in which it has sought to do that is to think about caste in a certain way. And how does it think about caste? Basically saying that nobody is outside of this Hindu social order. The so-called untouchables have to be brought into the Hindu social order. Ambedkar's question was always, if you're going to bring them in, they are not going to be brought in simply as untouchables. You have to assign them to a certain category. So what will you do? Will you make them Shudras? So he was very clear that nobody can be brought into the Hindu social order on equal terms. But that didn't stop either the Hindu Mahasabha or the Arya Samaj in doing this. The historian Charugupta's work has called attention to how this was done in the central provinces, in the United Provinces, in what is today Uttar Pradesh. How were the Dalits and the so-called lower caste co-opted into the Hindu framework? And one of the ways in which this was done was, of course, through Shuddhi and Sanghatan in the early period, and by trying to Hinduize certain sections of the Dalit community, particularly the Chamars, and the Balmikis, by sort of putting their putting their life experiences within a recognizably Hindu universe. And I think this is the reason why the Ambedkarite movement proved to be a challenge for the Arya Samaj in the United Provinces and became very strong, the Adi Hindu movement and the other movement. So I think it was a contestation that was taking place from almost as early as the 1930s. So in the context of the 1960s and afterwards, where there's a very singular attempt to co-opt the Dalits, clearly this is required both to polarize this Bahujan Dalit constituency, which nobody wants to come together. And I think this is, of course, the principle that Ambedkar says was set in place in ancient India, that the Kshatriyas and the Brahmins got together to keep everybody else out of the system of power. And today, I think co-opting the Dalits becomes very important wherever they constitute sizable vote banks. But also it's very important for the assertion of a Hindu identity. You see, Hindus don't feel comfortable in saying they're Hindus and getting on with it. They have to constantly either invent an outside enemy or constantly try and say, we are Hindus because we have done this for the Dalits. So their particular anxiety has to be assuaged either by positing themselves as reformers or by claiming an alien enemy. And they do this in a very clever, in a very twisted way by trying to co-opt the Dalits, saying, look, we are very open to Dalits being part of Hinduism, and by saying we will deploy the Dalits as shock troopers to fight the alien enemy, who in this case are the Muslims. So earlier they could rely on the so-called Shudras, and Ambedkar himself points that out in the colonial period. But today, because of the rise of the mandalization of electoral politics, the Shudras can go any which way, as happened in the 1980s in India and in the early 1990s. So I think for them, they want to cultivate the Dalit constituency in the hope that they would have a permanent fighting force against the Muslims. But thankfully, that has not happened consistently or everywhere at all times. And there's Ambedkarism and socialism and other sorts of progressive ideologies equally continue to draw the Dalits into their fold.
So, so much of what you've discussed today in the lecture feels so awfully prescient given the stuff that's the BJP is doing today in India. I was wondering if Ambedkar has thought about nationalisms not as Indian nationalisms, but different state nationalisms. So say Tamil nationalism or Kannada nationalism and so forth. And if that might offer some kind of resistance to this counter-revolutionary Gandhian nationalism.
That's another very ambiguous and tense moment in Ambedkar's thought world. I think largely because of the fact that he saw the untouchables, so-called untouchables, at least in his own lifetime, as being particularly friendless. No party was willing to endorse their claims, neither the nationalists, nor the socialists, nor the communists. So for him, the only guarantee for Dalit assertion, for only constitutional guarantee for Dalit rights was a unitary Indian state. He felt that it was the countervailing power of a federal state that would work against the possibility of dominant castes in different parts of India accessing power in their own provinces. So he committed himself to the ideal of a unitary state. and he did not consider what we would call different kinds of national ethnic or different kinds of provincial autonomy and assertion as something that would countervail this tendency on the part of the Brahmin Banya combined. While he was very sensitive to the fact of linguistic and other differences and for their cultivation and expansion in various other spheres of life, politically he did sort of subscribe to the kind idea of a unitary Indian state. Having said that, being the Democrat he was, over a period of time, had he been alive, he would have seen what the unitary Indian state was doing to all of us in this subcontinent, and he might have revised his opinions and rethought it, as he did all his life. But based on what he has written and based on his own commitment to a unitary Indian state from the point of view of the Dalits, that's what we have at present. And we have to think through that carefully.
Thank you.
So, right after you mentioned the Congress right wing gaining traction thanks to Gandhi, you mentioned two essays. One is Ranare Gandhi and Jinnah, and I couldn't catch the name of the other one.
Freedom, Federation versus Freedom.
Okay. And the other question that I had is when Ambedkar refers to the Gita or the Manusmriti, is there a particular edition that he is referring to? Is there a particular volume?
He refers to several editions. He footnotes all of them. And
Right.
you can read that in his own collection. And there's also Basant Moon's list of books that has been put together, which is a bibliography to Ambedkar's writings on history.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks again, ma'am. Again, it was a phenomenal lecture. I learned a lot. One of the central questions that I keep on coming back to when I read Ambedkar over and over is the race question. And pretty much every other writer, both during his time as well as after him, have sort of seen the Brahmin as the racial invader through the Aryan invasion theory. I mean, this is very true of Pule as well, Periyar as well. This idea that the Brahmins were sort of like the tip of the spear of the invader, who occupied the Indian subcontinent and pushed people down southwards. But Ambedkar is very distinct in sort of like taking the opposite position and pretty consistently claiming that there is absolutely no racial difference whatsoever among people belonging to different varnas. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about where that sort of like insistence comes from, because I've also been reading a lot of recent works, particularly that draw from genetics, which seem to make the opposite argument that there was an Aryan invasion, but it was mostly probably Aryan migration rather than an invasion and things like that. So I was wondering, if you could talk a little bit more about
Sure.
the sort of race question, particularly in the context of genetic research, if you even want to.
Ambedkar actually does not disagree with the idea of migration. He does agree that there were migrants coming into India. In fact, his argument is closer to the present day consensus that we are a heterogeneous people that came from different parts. So Ambedkar does agree to that. I think for what is important for him, there are two things here. One is, in a more general sense, he does not think that race can explain behavior. Racial origins cannot explain one's behavior, or racial origins do not have a bearing on the value systems we create or the worldviews that we come up with or the societies we construct. And this is something that I must say that he owes to his readings as a student in the United States at Columbia, where, among other things, his classes, he of course studied a great many disciplines, but his anthropology classes were taught by Alexander Goldenweiser, who was a student of Franz Boas. And these two men were singularly responsible for unseating the importance of race in explaining cultural differences. And anthropology was, as we know, made this very important sort of decisive break in talking of cultures as evolving and different and not to be measured along a racial scale, which was far more common and far more available to American sociologists and anthropologists, indeed people across the world in the early 20th century, given the kind of historical situation at that time, and that much of the studying of other cultures was done by white men. So the anthropological racial framework was very widely available. So Boas and Goldenweiser, his student, did a lot to unseat the importance of race as an analytical explanatory principle for talking about the quality of cultures or the content of cultures and civilizations. I think that made a very deep impression on Ambedkar, that you cannot use racial origin just as you cannot use caste origin to explain character, behavior, culture, meaning, and so on. Things cannot be done that way, because those who do them deploy these arguments to arrange races or characters along a hierarchy, which Ambedkar was resolutely against. So that's at the level of a democratic analytical approach to the subject of race. Now, in a historical sense, he did see that there were several migrations that took place. That he never sort of doubted. And he also says that there were autochthonous communities, like the Nagas, for example, indigenous communities. So he does concede that there were different kinds of ethnic racial groups that were resident in the Indian subcontinent, and they came to mix up over a period of time. But historically for him, it was important to see the power of the priestly class as the power of a class also. And classes emerge from within very defined socio-historic, political and economic context. So there too for him, race did not make much sense as an analytical or even descriptive category, because he wanted us to see classes as a creation of human institutions, of human beings interacting with each other in the circumstances given to them. So his history is a product of human effort. So in that sense, he wanted us to see them as part of our social setup rather than as racial outsiders.
I actually joined a bit late, so sorry if I missed anything and I'm repeating this question. But I want to know, how much is the role of media in this? For example, when Mayawati and Lalu were in power, you heard the media constantly going after them, calling them megalomaniacs and, trivializing everything that they did. And it was like literally like as if a lower caste person was not fit to rule. And there was a complete biased opinion frame about them. And so and eventually we saw that how they were they became unpopular and of course washed away by the Hindutva wave. So how much do you think that is a part of this?
You mean in the present or the past?
I mean in the past, when Mayawati was eventually she went away from power.
See, the thing is, even in Ambedkar's own time, he was very reviled by the media. Let's not forget that also. As he says in Rana Day, Gandhi and Jinnah, the Congress press hates me. And I can't help thinking that's because they can't stand my untouchable status, or that an untouchable can be an intellectual. He says that very frankly. And his own attempts at starting and running newspapers is because he felt that the media or the press in his own time was extremely biased, that he could not countenance a dissenting point of view. So there were papers that respected him a great deal, or respected his views a great deal as well. Certainly, if you were to think of the media as a conveyor of public opinion or as a shaper of public opinion, and the fact is, and it has been time and again told to us how the media houses in India, definitely the English media, is completely not plural. You don't have a sufficient presence of Dalit Bahujan journalists or thinkers who are present as part of the media in any meaningful way. The vernacular media is somewhat different. More Dalits and Bahujans are perhaps part of vernacular media, but vernacular media has a far more greater obvious investment in Hindutva in certain parts of the country. So yes, the media does play a role in sort of marshalling arguments in a certain way. And in that sense, the media is a reflector of what is always present in Hindu society at large, and which it can magnify if it chooses to, which it can also balance by pointing to other developments. Some of the more liberal media wake up to this and do it from now and then. For example, if you take the Hindu from Madras, whom the self-respect Periyar's movement used to joke and call the Mahavishnu of Mount Road, pointing to their very sort of, how their liberalism is a veneer for their upper caste interests. The Hindu in the 1990s understood that the moment of Mandal Masjid was very important, and for whatever reason, it invited a number of anti-caste intellectuals to write in its pages. So you had Ailaya, you had Gay Lomwet, you had M.S.S. Pandey, and all of them writing for the Hindu. So there are ways in which the liberal media can also bring in another point of view if it chooses to. But if it doesn't choose to, it doesn't have to, like we see with certain editions of the Times of India. So I think the challenge is for us to think of the media as situated in a in a culture where there are heterogeneous opinions, and the media tries to convince us that these opinions don't all matter in the same way. So I think it has created this illusion of some things being important and good and many other things being irrelevant. So it is not that our society is incapable of thinking outside of the media, but that the media pushes and plays a hegemonic role because it represents certain interests and because it does not always want to rise above those interests. And today is very committed to a right-wing agenda for the most part.
Hi. There was a
Hi.
question earlier about linguistic states nationalism and India as a state nationalism. In a
Right.
book, Linguistic States, Baba Sahib talks about linguistic nationalism as a problem when we structure the states on the basis of languages versus India as a nation. And Baba Sahib was obviously for India as a nation. However, he still says that the advantages of linguistic states outweigh uh, the, the drawback of linguistic nationalism that might arise. Your views, madam?
I think Ambedkar shifted position on that in a very interesting way because I think he sees the dangers of linguistic nationalism because I think nationalism as such, he does see as contributing to a certain sense of exclusivism. And I think working from within the Maharashtrian context, which was part of Maharashtra was in the central provinces, he saw the value also of a heterogeneous cultural world where people from different cultures could come together and actually be part of a rich citizen world. But he also saw the dangers of a nationalism which thrived on what he considered Hindu and Hindi, and how that could lead to the domination of the Hindi speaking dominant caste over the rest of India. So he considered the value of linguistic provinces, but he yet wondered if one shouldn't have an official language that was something that the whole of India could subscribe to, and so on. So he had this very sort of a position he tried to balance over a period of time. And I think for him, the Samyukta Maharashtra moment was the tipping point, which sees him actually take up the cause of linguistic states in a far more forthright manner than he had done in the past, because he sees the value of that to some extent. Personally speaking, rather than call it linguistic nationalism, I do think that different parts of India have had very different lines of historical, have seen very different lines of historical change and development. We are all heterogeneous in different ways, and our heterogeneity has been our strength, but we've also expressed this heterogeneity in and through particular forms of expression and drawing on our rich linguistic histories. So for me, I think the histories of different parts of India are what constitute the history of India. I am not comfortable with the national version of this history, nor with a state that rules from top down. I am all for a very rich federalism on on the basis of which each of the Indian states interacts with each other and learns from each other rather than root everything via Delhi. This is my personal understanding.
Thanks, man.